Most of us, I'm sure, are at least familiar with the concept of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It comes from the 1886 novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But in this story, we have Gabriel John Utterson, who is the attorney, the lawyer for Dr. Jekyll. And he's concerned with Jekyll because Jekyll has just made Mr. Hyde the sole beneficiary of his estate. Utterson is fearful because he thinks that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll. And so he goes and investigates the situation, and he unearths the story of what happened. And we find that Jekyll has concocted this serum that allows him to transform his physical body into Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde is a complete contrast to Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll is clean-cut, moral, the good, upstanding citizen in the world, while Mr. Hyde is self-indulgent, doesn't care about anybody else. It's just about how he can get what he wants. So in this serum, when he transforms himself into Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll is able to indulge in his sinful vices with no fear of detection. And so he goes throughout that, and everything seems fine and as it should. But then one night, Dr. Jekyll involuntarily transforms into Mr. Hyde. And it begins a series of downward spiral, that these involuntary transformations occur more and more frequently. And Jekyll's ability to control and transform himself out of Hyde and back into Jekyll is more and more difficult. Eventually, he realizes that one day he's going to transform into Mr. Hyde and never be able to come back as Jekyll. So the sad reality of the story ends by Jekyll writing a confession note and taking his own life. And as I think about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it just makes me feel, man, that's how a lot of followers of Jesus try to live. We want to look the part. We want to look together. Want to be the upstanding citizens who everybody says, oh, that person's a follower of Jesus. But yet we want to indulge in our sinful desires with no fear of detection. We want the both and. But the reality is, you can have it your way or you can have it God's way, but you can't have both. But yet we still try to do that. Now, James, in chapter 4, has some insights for us about the internal struggle that would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this struggle is what causes fights, what causes quarrels, what pulls us apart. And he says, starting in chapter 4, verse 1, what is causing quarrels and fights among you? Don't they know they come from the desires that are sinful in your heart? You want what you don't have, so you fight and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it. So you scheme and quarrel and wage war to take it from them. Yet you don't have because you don't ask God. And when you do ask, you still don't get because you don't ask with the right motives. You want only what will give you pleasure. Now we recognize conflict is part of life. Now James is talking about fights and quarrels. There's a difference between conflict and a fight and a quarrel. Now, I know we kind of use some of those words interchangeably, but as James is talking, he's talking about those rifts that are just destructive. You get enough people in a room, you're going to have disagreements over something. You can have disagreements over some of you might have a disagreement over which restaurant you should eat at after lunch or for lunch today. Or maybe not at which restaurant should you get to go. I don't know what restaurants are open now. But those are our conflicts. Those are our earth-shattering, life-changing things. But James is talking about things that just tear us apart. And actually, throughout his book, he talks about different levels and layers of conflict. In chapter 1, he reminds us that we should be quick to listen, that we should be slow to speak, slow to get angry, and those things can help solve a lot of fights and conflicts. In chapter 2, he talks about we should not show favoritism. Just because somebody has more means or more status does not mean that we should actually give them a better place in our lives or the church. In chapter 3, he talks about selfish ambition and how that can destroy relationships. That if we put selfish ambition over everything else, it hurts our ability to connect with people. Later in chapter 4, he'll talk about slander and judgment and how those are just detrimental to ourselves in this world. And in chapter 5, he talks about how the rich can oppress the poor by withholding wages and just really knocking them down. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So fights and quarrels are part of life. But really what they do is they show that life is not how it should be. You know, when God created the world, he didn't create it so we would hate each other. And when Jesus Christ came and died on the cross for our sins, he didn't do that so we could hate each other. He did that because he has overcome. And there are different levels of fights. We recognize that. There are some that you're miffed and tomorrow you're going to be fine. There are some that we just really hurt each other, and so for weeks and months and years, we continue to live in these hurt places. But too many times we try to solve these fights and quarrels or conflicts in ways that take God out of the equation. And I think that's when we really start to see the negative side of things come up. Because what happens is our spiritual immaturity surfaces. You know, when we're not spiritually mature, and we all have moments of spiritual immaturity, but when we're not spiritually mature, there's no way that we can love people the way God loves them, which is what he calls us to do. All this is about our selfishness, about getting our way. But it's come back to the spiritual side of things. You can have it your way, or you can have it God's way, but you can't have both. But yet we still hold on to that dream of being able to be self-indulgent and be the follower of Jesus at the same time. But James talks about our desires. You know, we all have wants, desires, things that would just be fantastic for us to have, right? Those are things that just a lot of times drive our thought process and our motivations. And desires are not necessarily sinful. God gave us desires. He gave us desire to eat food, and so food is not sinful. It's good when we eat. But in order for our desires to be good, they must first and foremost honor God. And we can honor God with anything and everything we do, right? We can honor God with eating food. Praise the Lord, right? That's fantastic, that we can honor God by fulfilling our desires. But as James is talking about, there's some envy that's coming in. We see what others have and we can't get it, so we wage war to try to take it away from them. We try to do all we can so that they don't have it. Now, it may be hard for us to say, well, I don't do that. Well, in all reality, we worry about ourselves first. We worry about how we can get ahead, how we can have our things, how our life can be better. And this word desire that James uses is used many times throughout the New Testament, and every time it's used with negative connotations. Obviously, if you attach sinful to desires, it's negative, but the New Testament uses this word desires and negative connotations to show how these desires in our lives can pull us away from God. There are things in your life that are desires that are not necessarily bad, but because of how we indulge them or use them or allow them to impact our lives, they pull us away from who God is, which is why jealousy creates rifts in relationships. And so I say, well, these jealous things, these envious things in our lives pull us away from others, but they first and foremost pull us away from God. And when we pull away from God, we can't have right relationships with others. If we don't have a right relationship with God, we can't have a right relationship with others. So we have to make sure we recognize what is at stake here, what's causing issues. And so the desires that we have to be submitted to God. Only when our desires are submitted to God can we actually fulfill those desires in ways that honor God. And when we do that, then the desires become more fulfilling, more satisfying. They just become good. But unsubmitted desires rear their head in ugly ways. They rear their head in ways that just cause conflict and frustration and wars and fightings with other people. And often, we live as though the biggest objective in life is to have things that are pleasurable. As James says, you only want things that give you pleasure. Now, there's nothing wrong with having your desires met or pleasure or those types of things, but it's about fulfilling them in ways that don't honor God. So I think this is where humility comes into place for at least most of us. Patrick Lencioni is a leadership guru guy, and he's written several books that are very good, very entertaining, and very insightful. And what he does, he tells a story, and then he applies it. So the first 100 pages or so is a story, then the next 50 pages or so is how you apply that to your life. And in the book, The Ideal Team Player, he basically says that people have three characteristics, or there's three characteristics of the ideal team player: hungry, humble, and smart. And not everybody has all three characteristics, and if you're lacking one or two, it's not always the end of the world, but sometimes it can be detrimental if you have a specific combination. See, someone who's hungry is someone who's ambitious. Somebody has a drive to succeed and do better. Somebody who is smart, he kind of equates to emotional intelligence. You're able to read people. You're able to understand what drives people, what motivates people, what moves people. And then somebody who is humble just cares about people. Sees how their actions impact people and actually cares about it. And so if somebody has all three, that's fantastic. That person is somebody you really want to work with and be on your team. But he says the most dangerous person is the person who is hungry and smart, but not humble. Because what that means, the person has ambition, has drive to succeed. They also know how people think and how to move people and how to inspire people, but they don't care about people. So maybe that's the narcissism that he would actually define. I'm not exactly sure. But what it does is you just use people as a means to an end. You have a drive to succeed and just use people to get your way. So we take humility out of the equation. And people get bulldozed. See, the people that are impacted by the person who is hungry and smart know that they're hurt, but the person who's not humble either doesn't care or doesn't know. And it hurts. It hurts when humility is just not part of who we are. But James gives us a warning here and talks about humility as well. And he says, "You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I will say it again. If you are a friend of the world, you are an enemy of God." Don't the scriptures have meaning? They say that God is passionate, that the Spirit He placed within us should be faithful to Him. And He gives grace generously, as the scriptures say. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And I think this is an issue that if you're not experiencing, don't think you're experiencing, then I think you need to talk to other people and see how this is causing problems in your life. Because all of us have this tension in our life. We see our past life, and I don't know if I want to leave that. And then we have God over here, and God, I love you, I want you, but that looks really good over there. And obviously, I don't think we're always having those types of conversations. We're going throughout life and saying, I'm following God, and then something catches our eye. Something catches our attention, and it tries to pull us away. But James says you can either be a friend of God, or you can be a friend of the world. And if you are not 100% a friend of God, then you are a friend of the world. You can have it your way, you can have it God's way, but you can't have both. And it's an issue that I think sometimes we say it's not a big deal. Because we like to say, well, I'm not of the world, but I'm in the world. Right? I've got to relate to the world. We've got to have these things where we connect with people to draw them to Jesus, which is true. But the reality is, you either use the world or the world uses you. If you think about that, see Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they were functioning as two different individuals. But the more Dr. Jekyll became Mr. Hyde, the more Mr. Hyde was who he actually was. And eventually it came to the point where he couldn't go back to Dr. Jekyll. And I think too many times we're trying to hold on to our past life and hold on to God, but the more we hold on to the past life, the less we're actually holding on to God. And eventually we're going to be assimilated into the world in a way that there's not a difference between a follower of Jesus and the world. We're just slowly getting over there. See, at first it was great. Well, I can indulge in my sinful vices with no fear of detection. But eventually we just get closer and closer and closer to just being that sinful nature. But let me pause for a moment, because I'm talking about the difference between the world and God. And as James defines the world, it's not just talking about the physical world. I mean, you all will leave here, you'll go to your homes, you'll get food, the grocery store, workplaces. You know, the places that you actually go in the world are not just intrinsically evil. Whether you're talking about the office or the grocery store, I'm not saying that those places are just completely evil. Because James is not talking about the physical world, he's talking about the spiritual realm. He's talking about the realm that is influenced by Satan and his schemes and directed by Satan. It's the morally fallen world that just is contrary to who God is. And when we understand the world is this spiritual evil world, that spiritual realm of the world, we recognize that followers of Jesus do not fit there. That's what I'm talking about. So we need to be of the world in the sense of we need to be participants in society and make sure that we function and do things right and influence people that way. But the world, as James is defining it, of this spiritual realm, we do not fit there. And if we fit there, we've got a problem. Then all we are is Mr. Hyde, trying to indulge in our sinful desires. So the world is contrary to God in every way, which is why the Spirit that God has placed in us is so important. If God has placed a Spirit in us, God is passionate that Spirit should be faithful. God didn't give us His Spirit so that we could just indulge in all our sinful desires. And you know what that means? Is that God has given us His Spirit so we can have victory in this world of evil. Not so that we have to indulge in the sinful world, but we have to reject the world. We have to live contrary to what the world is. But as James talks about our desires, our pleasure, our just the things we want, we come to the conclusion that our desires are experienced in the fullness when they honor God. Too many times we look at the options of sin and say, ooh, that would be so great. And let's be honest, if sin didn't look great, if sin didn't package itself real nicely, there would be no temptation there. But sin looks good. Woo! Man, I want some of that. I want to indulge in whatever that may be. But it's false. The outside may look good, the packaging may look good, but the inside is worthless. And it's meaningless. And so when James is talking about fulfilling our desires, when we fulfill our desires in ways that honor God, it brings fulfillment. It's the best way. It's not God being oppressive. He's saying, that may look good, but it's false. Here's the best way to do it. Too many times we view that as, well, we got to follow these list of rules that are oppressive or burdensome or just sucks all the fun out of it. And I believe this is where humility comes in. Because humility is about submitting ourselves to who God is. It's not just about allowing your preferences to go on the back burner in a conversation. It's about saying, God, you are Lord, and I'm going to trust that, I'm going to serve that, and I'm going to have all my life flow through the concept that you are the Lord of my life. But the great thing is that God provides grace. You know, He gives grace generously. If we're humble, if we seek Him, He pours His grace out on us. But pride is the opposite of humility, and what pride does is it seeks to govern mine own life without God. It says, God, I know this is what you want to do, but you know, I've got a better idea. You just sit back, I've got it from here. If I need help, I'll let you know. There's the difference between humility and pride, because God doesn't say, hey, what should we do? He says, come join me. God invites us in His plan. He doesn't say, God's not, He's not riding shotgun with you. He lets you get in the car. And there's a difference, but too many times we just are trying to drive ourselves and do everything ourselves and be our own God. So James says, humble yourselves before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and He will come close to you. Wash your hands and purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears, sorrow, and grief for what you have done. Let there be sadness instead of laughter, and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor. Isn't it great to know that the closer we get to God, the further Satan gets from us? So, and that's, I think sometimes we fail to take advantage of that power we have. Because if I'm next to God, Satan can't stand it. He can't be there. So we need to resist Satan to get closer to God. And when we get closer to God, we're going to just have this protection around us that Satan can't penetrate, that he cannot infiltrate when we are close to God. But one of the great things about God is he reveals himself to us. In the Church of the Nazarene, we have this concept called prevenient grace. Other traditions may call it common grace. And what it is God gives us grace to let us know he's there. Before you came to know Jesus, the only way you came to know Jesus was because God gave you grace. He said, hey, I'm here. You need to change. I've got something better for you. And so wherever we are, God's grace is active and alive in our life, letting us know, hey, I'm here. I want to be with you. Come close to me. God is drawing us to him. He's bringing us into who he is. When we come close to God, what it does is it rejects everything else. And we are called to come close to God and be close to who he is. And throughout his book, James stresses the destructive nature of sin. We can all agree that sin causes destruction. It wreaks havoc in our lives, in the world, and just causes bad things to happen. And unfortunately, we're naturally prideful or greedy. We naturally want to satisfy our sinful desires. That is what we naturally want to become, Mr. Hyde. We want to indulge and allow those things to just happen all throughout our lives. James calls us to live in a world that is sinful, but live the humility that is through Jesus Christ and submit to him. But this last part that James talks about is always convicting for me. Because let there be tears and sorrow and grief for all that you've done. And as I think about this, I think it's important for us to make sure we consider what our life was like before Jesus. It's not always pretty. It's not always something we want to look back on and say, that was great. Now, I'm not saying every choice you made, even if it had bad consequences, I'm not saying that we need to go and just look at every choice and dissect it and feel guilty about that. But we have to recognize that sin tears us away from who God is. And we need to just grieve the fact that we allowed sin in our lives, which pulled us away from God, even if we didn't know what we were doing. But I think we also need to make sure we have self-awareness in our lives now, that when sin enters our life, that we grieve and mourn and say, how did I let that happen? Now, we're not perfect. I'm not trying to be self-condemning. But we need to recognize that the powers of this world are strong. And there are times that, you know what, we're not going to be perfect. And when that happens, we need to come back. We need to come close to Jesus. We need to resist the devil. And we're going to say, oh my goodness, how have I hurt God with my actions? How have I hurt myself with my actions? How have I allowed that to just be something that infiltrated my life? Now, through Jesus, the great thing is we can be made new. We can be restored. We can be reconciled. We can be redeemed. Submitting ourselves to Jesus is not devaluing ourselves. It's not just saying, well, I'm worthless. It's recognizing my true worth that is in Jesus. God continually works in our life. He's moving. He's active. He's drawing us to him. He's guiding us. He's doing all these things. But he's never done, which means we're never done. That God is continually working in our lives. But we have to come to grips that we can have it God's way, we can have it my way, but we can't have it both. You got to pick. And if we choose not 100% God's way, we're eventually going to become more and more and more Mr. Hyde. But the great news is Jesus can redeem us. He can save us. He can save us from that sin. And so even though Dr. Jekyll couldn't figure out how to get the serum to be more effective, God doesn't have that limitation. God can restore us no matter what mess we've got us in. Now, there may be consequences. I'm not saying that all those things are just going away, but there's never a mess that you can get yourself in that God can't save you from. Because remember, we're talking about the spiritual realm, the spiritual issue. We're talking about how we desire our past life. And so I want to encourage you today. We're going to sing the song, Graves in the Garden, and or Graves into Gardens. And the verse, or the chorus, several times talks about there's nothing better than you, referring to God. So if we're talking about our sinful desires, ooh, that looks good, that's packaged real nice, I want to indulge in that. But it affirms, God, there actually is nothing better than you. No matter what this world offers me, no matter what this world says is good, there's nothing better than you. And then just the title, and it says this in the song, it's going to turn your graves into gardens. God's going to restore the brokenness in your life, and He can make it beautiful. Praise be to God.